on Chapter 1, the blood-brain barrier. Although the brain, like any other organ, needs to receive nutrients from the blood, many chemicals cannot cross from the blood to the brain. The mechanism that excludes the most chemicals from the vertebrate brain is known as the blood-brain barrier. Before we examine how it works, let's consider why we need it. Why we need a blood-brain barrier. When a virus invades a cell, mechanisms within the cell extrude virus particles through the membrane so that the immune system can find them. When the immune cells discover a virus, they kill it and the cell that contains it. In effect, a cell exposing a virus through its membrane says, "Look, immune system, I'm infected with a virus. Kill me and save the others." This plan works well if the virus-infected cell is, for example, a skin cell or a blood cell, which the body can replace easily. However, with few exceptions, the vertebrate brain does not replace damaged neurons. If you had to sacrifice brain cells whenever you had a viral infection, you would not do well. To minimize the risk of irreparable damage to the brain, the body lines the brain's blood vessels with tightly packed cells that keep out most viruses, bacteria, and harmful chemicals. However, certain viruses do cross the blood-brain barrier. What happens then? When rabies virus invades the blood-brain barrier, it infects the brain and leads to death. The spirochete, responsible for syphilis, also penetrates the blood-brain barrier, producing long-lasting and potentially fatal consequences. The microglia are more effective against several viruses that enter the brain, mounting an inflammatory response that fights the virus without killing the neuron. However, this response may control the virus without eliminating it. When the chickenpox virus enters the spinal cord cells, virus particles remain there long after they've been exterminated from the rest of the body. The virus may emerge from the spinal cords decades later, causing a painful condition called shingles. Similarly, the virus responsible for genital herpes hides in the nervous system, producing little harm but periodically emerging to cause new genital infections. How the blood-brain barrier works. The blood-brain barrier depends on endothelial cells that form the walls of the capillaries. Outside the brain, such cells are separated by small gaps, but in the brain they are joined together so tightly that they block viruses, bacteria, and other harmful chemicals from passage. If the blood-brain barrier is such a good defense, you might ask, why don't we have similar walls around all our other organs? The answer is that the barrier keeps out useful chemicals as well as harmful ones. Those useful chemicals include all fuels and amino acids, the building blocks for proteins. For these chemicals to cross the blood-brain barrier, the brain needs special mechanisms not found in the rest of the body. No special mechanism is required for small, uncharged molecules such as oxygen and carbon dioxide that cross through the cell walls freely. Also, molecules that dissolve into the fats of the membrane cross easily. Examples include vitamins A and D, and all the drugs that affect the brain, from antidepressants and other psychiatric drugs to illegal drugs such as heroin. How fast a drug takes effect depends largely on how readily it dissolves in fats and therefore crosses the blood-brain barrier. Water crosses through a special protein channel in the wall of the endothelial cells. For certain other chemicals, the brain uses active transport, a protein-mediated process that expends energy to pump chemicals from the blood into the brain. Chemicals that are actively transported into the brain include glucose, the brain's main fuel, amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, purines, chlorine, a few vitamins, and iron. Insulin and probably certain other hormones also cross the blood-brain barrier, at least in small amounts, although the mechanism is not yet known. The blood-brain barrier is essential to health. In people with Alzheimer's disease and similar conditions, the endothelial cells lining the brain's blood vessels shrink, and harmful chemicals enter the brain. However, the barrier possesses a difficulty for treating brain cancers because nearly all the drugs used for chemotherapy fail to cross the blood-brain barrier. Nourishment of vertebrate neurons. Most cells use a variety of carbohydrates and fats for nutrition, but vertebrate neurons depend almost entirely on glucose, a sugar. Cancer cells and the other testis cells that make up sperm also rely overwhelmingly on glucose. Because metabolizing glucose requires oxygen, neurons need a steady supply of oxygen. Although the human brain constitutes only about 2% of the body weight, it uses about 20% of its oxygen and 25% of its glucose. Why do neurons depend so heavily on glucose? They can and sometimes do use ketones, a type of fat, and lactate for fuel. However, glucose is the only nutrient that crosses the blood-brain barrier in large quantities. Although neurons require glucose, glucose shortage is rarely a problem, except during starvation. The liver also makes glucose from many kinds of carbohydrates and amino acids, as well as from glycerol, a breakdown product from fats. A more likely problem is inability to use glucose. To use glucose, the body needs thiamine. Prolonged thiamine deficiency, common in chronic alcoholism, leads to death of neurons and a condition called Korsakoff syndrome, marked by severe memory impairments. In closing, neurons. What does the study of individual neurons tell us about behavior? Everything the brain does depends on detailed anatomy of its neurons and glia. In a later chapter, we consider the physiology of learning, where one slogan is that cells that fire together wire together. That is, neurons active at the same time become connected. However, that is only true if the neurons active at the same time are also approximately in the same place. The brain cannot connect dendrites or axons that cannot find each other. In short, the location, structures, and activities of your neurons are the basis for everything you experience, learn, and do. However, nothing in your experience or behavior follows from the properties of any one neuron. The nervous system is more than the sum of its individual cells, just as water is more than the sum of oxygen and hydrogen. Our behaviour emerges from communication among neurons. Summary. Neurons receive information and convey it to other cells. The nervous system also contains glia, cells that enhance and modify the activities of neurons in many ways. In the late 1800s, Santiago Ramon y Cajal used newly discovered staining techniques to establish that the nervous system is composed of separate cells, now known as neurons. Neurons contain the same internal structures as other animal cells. Neurons have these major parts: a cell body or soma, dendrites, an axon with branches, and a presynaptic terminals. Neuron shape varies greatly depending on their functions and their connections with other cells. Because of the blood-brain barrier, many molecules cannot enter the brain. The barrier protects the nervous system from viruses and many dangerous chemicals. The blood-brain barrier consists of an unbroken wall of cells that surround the blood vessels of the brain and the spinal cord. A few uncharged molecules such as water, oxygen, and carbon dioxide can cross the barrier freely. So do molecules that dissolve in fats. Active transport proteins pump glucose, amino acids, and a few other chemicals into the brain and spinal cord. Certain hormones, including insulin, can also cross the blood-brain barrier. Neurons rely heavily on glucose, the only nutrient that crosses the blood-brain barrier in large quantities. They also need thiamine, vitamin B1, to use glucose. And then there is a list of key terms, thought questions, and an end of module quiz. Please remember to look at the diagrams and the readings underneath, because we do not go through them in an audio format. Thank you. That is the end of chapter 1.1, the cells of the nervous system.